Yes, Mark Kurlansky.
Yeah, if I could sneak in a couple of questions, short ones. I was curious about the hidden diaries. Where did you find them? Did family members give them to you? Or?
No, some of them are kind of, most of them are published. Some of them are unpublished, kind of in memorial sites. I mean, I went to a lot of concentration camp memorial sites. They all have.
So they're no longer hidden. They were just hidden at that
time.
No,
they were hidden at the time. I mean, you've got to imagine. I mean, this includes notes and letters written by Jewish prisoners forced by the Nazis to work at the gas chambers in Auschwitz, who hid these notes in little bottles, which they then buried in the ground.
And they had cameras as well, you said, right?
Well, there was a camera which was smuggled in, and kind of they managed to take some photos, and those photos still exist. But there are also some prisoners who managed to write very, very long diaries undetected. I mean, there's a Norwegian prisoner called Odd Nansen, and his diaries are actually literally just being republished. A lot of this material is long out of print. And Nansen keeps a very long diary in a camp called Sachsenhausen near Berlin because he's relatively privileged as a Norwegian prisoner, and he can record the goings-on and the suffering of other prisoners. And one thing that sticks in my mind is a scene he describes of again, unimaginable suffering in February 1945. And he writes after that in this secret diary, "My language is exhausted." He doesn't have any more words to describe this horror, and I don't know what you felt, but that's something which echoed around in my head a lot when I tried to write
Edward R. Murrow, when he got to, was it Buchenwald? And he said, I have no words. Mm-hmm. And I think that had a huge impact on the American public when his stature was such that when he went there and he couldn't say anything.
But it's interesting that the prisoners felt that too. I mean, there's another diary I've used of a female prisoner, a Hungarian prisoner in Auschwitz, and she kind of later writes a diary kind of in another camp where it's possible for her to write secret notes. And she writes about how in 1944 there are these women in Auschwitz, Hungarian Jews, who talk about how their suffering could ever be commemorated or explained to somebody who wasn't there. And they think, could it be with a film? Could it be music? Could it be art? Kind of how could we ever explain what happened to us? And in the end, they come to the conclusion that they can't. There isn't a kind of way to really capture this.
Did you had a
I just wondered if I can just sneak in another question to Susan about. So did you go to U.S. government people or just archives? And if you went to people, what were they resisting?
I did not go to U.S. government officials. No, just archives, because I was trying to juxtapose what was happening in the U.S. and how the U.S. was perceiving, but I needed to stay focused on the survivors' stories over the 70 years.
Anybody else have a comment? Is okay too. Yes.
I think it was about a week ago, I read an article in the New York Times about how many of the survivors are living in poverty now. How is that possible?
Do you want to repeat the question?
The question was about how many survivors are living in poverty now. Well, Nick, you might be able to answer it about England. I'm on the board of something called the Blue Card, which is an organization in the United States which is devoted to helping poor Holocaust survivors. And the reason is that, in a certain number of cases, they came here after the Second World War. They didn't have family here. They were from Europe. They were accepted as refugees, so they didn't have the family support structures. They didn't do, some of them did not make much money over the course of their lives, and now they're elderly, and they don't, they need some help. We have dentists who are involved who provide free dental care for Holocaust survivors through the Blue Card, and you wouldn't think it would be a problem. You would think that the mainstream Jewish organizations would have taken care of these folks, but they've kind of slipped through the cracks, and it's been a problem for a while. The Blue Card has been around for a while, and it's if you're interested, just get in touch with the Blue Card. You could help them out.
I mean,
happen to see the article? It was a rather big article. I
it
think it was in the New York Times. It could have been the Wall Street Journal because I've been reading about it.
it was a constant struggle kind of after the war for survivors to get even some kind of compensation or pension from the authorities. And I mentioned before the Dachau survivor who comes over to America, works as a professional Santa Claus here, goes back and lives in abject poverty. And one of the files I found in his, I managed to track down his restitution files. So that's his claims to the German authorities. And again and again and again, even his meager pension wasn't paid to him. I mean, he literally was more or less starving. And he then writes this letter I found in his file in 1979, where he writes to the German authorities from Italy, something along the lines of kind of, it would probably be better for everybody if I killed myself. You know, then you would have one complainant less to deal with. I mean, this is not an isolated story.
Yeah, there's something called the U.S. Claims Conference, which for about the last 20 years has been, Paul Volcker and Stuart Eisenstadt and others have been involved in trying to get more money, but it doesn't end up being very much money for any individual Holocaust survivor. Lily?
Oh, I'm just going to say that I know people who were in their 40s and their parents were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they get tested every year. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that while early on, I was trying to, how do you reconcile the government sort of ignoring it so early, and now they do this very extensive testing of the
Which
children.
government ignoring?
Japan. They do the children and the grandchildren of survivors.
Yes.
Which I was so surprised because I'd only heard the ignoring story.
Well, Japan resisted providing health care benefits to the Hibakusha.
Yes, that I heard.
It was the United States that denied radiation altogether.
I see.
Yeah.
That answers my question.
That's,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. And the research continues.
Yeah.
There's massive lifelong studies for both the aging survivors, their children, and then their grandchildren. Because, as you said, the children have not, there have been no scientific data that there's been an outcome, but they're not sure if it's going to skip a generation. So there's still questions.
And the other thing, that I guess everybody knows is that the nuclear weapons we have now are 100 times the power
Yes.
of Nagasaki, or more. Yes.
Hi there. My name's Robin. I'm very curious to know how you dealt personally with the horrific events that were described to you in your interviews around staying true to the goal of your mission and the goal of telling this bigger picture and the goal of staying true to your project. How did you handle that when listening and receiving all this information, from people who had been so traumatized and continued this? What do you do personally how did you deal?
Great question.
My main way was that I grew to really love the survivors that I got to know. I knew them. I knew their stories far better than their children did, for example. Some of their children speak and read English, and they've learned so much about their parents. So because I cared about them so much and how different each one was, and like you were saying, and how, trying to capture their unique experience, and because I cared about them so much as older adults, that's what helped me stay grounded. It doesn't mean that I always felt grounded. There were many times where I couldn't bear it anymore. But that was my touch point all the time. Having their photos as I knew them at the time of the writing, as older adults, having them right in front of me to look at and to remember their energy and their essence, their way of expressing themselves, the way they. Some of them began to care for me as a human being. There was a relationship there. That was what helped me the most.
Nick.
And also, I'm just going to say one thing, that we had to be very, in our selection of photographs, we decided not to publish some of the worst photographs. So it wasn't like we were always going quite as bad as it was even.
Nick, to end on on a more cheerful note. How did you
I don't think so.
stay- Well, you devoted your whole career, this isn't the only book you've written on this area. How do you stay cheerful amid this subject matter?
Well, I do Steve's yoga lessons. No, it's
Glad you do. I don't do them.
I don't either. It's not always easy. I mean, I think among the most difficult challenges really are to try and keep your empathy for the people you're writing about, but also you have to have some distance to this material to be able to write it. If I broke into tears every time I looked at these testimonies, I wouldn't be able to write. So it's a tricky line you walk here, and another really tricky challenge for me in this book was to make a decision about which stories I would tell and which ones I couldn't tell. Each prisoner experienced the camp in their own way, and each of those stories deserves to be told, but I couldn't tell them all. And that, in some ways, was the hardest thing in this book, to leave some of these incredible stories out. Sometimes not writing about it is harder than writing about it.
So before we go, I just want to read...
That wasn't really a positive.
No, that was good. I just want to read the titles of all these books for C-SPAN viewers who might have tuned in the middle, so you can go out and buy them. Well, Steve Luxenberg's is going to be called Separate, and it's not even ready for pre-order yet because it's not finished. But look for it fairly soon. Right? You're going to want to read that. And Nick Wachsmann's book is called KL, which is my German isn't good, but that just means
Konzentrationslager, concentration camp.
Right. And Susan Southard's book is called Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War. Thanks to everybody for coming tonight.